sponsored today by the Post Office, but it might be libraries, it might be village halls, it might be local independent shops, the type of places which forge community, that are formative of social norms and values, as well as being places of convenience. And I think there is a very real question for policymakers about what we can do to support and sustain those local assets over time, not just to create community, but also as the foundation for local economies and local growth as well, which we know is the priority for this new government. I'm not going to wax lyrical for too much longer. The only thing that I want to do is introduce a fantastic panel to discuss this subject with us today. So going from right to left, and this won't be quite the order that we speak in, but I'm delighted to be joined by Robert Buckland, who is the Secretary of State for Wales in the government, but a long-standing Cabinet Minister as both Solicitor General and Justice Secretary under previous government, someone who has deep experience at the top of government and a wide-ranging level of experience in dealing with a whole range of different questions. So thank you, Robert, for giving up your time to be here today. I will then come to Miriam Cates, the MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge, and also the chair of the new Social Covenant Unit, an MP who has done a huge amount of work on how to sustain local community, how to give back people a sense of belonging and that feeling of kind of local identity, which I know is very important in her neck of the woods, but actually something she's campaigned for at a national level as well. So delighted you're here with us today, Miriam. I will then come to Peter Foster, who is at the Financial Times, a journalist who, despite working for what is traditionally seen as a very economic and dry financial newspaper, has actually done a series of reports on the state of civic society and the effect of things like the cost of living crisis on civic society, and someone we've worked with very closely around things like the proliferation of parish councils and the value of that local governance layer in supporting levelling up and community strength. So thank you, Peter. Our fourth speaker of six will be Imogen Sinclair. Imogen is the director of the new Social Covenant Unit, someone who's worked very closely with both Miriam and Danny Kruger over the last few years in trying to articulate, I'm not going to put too many words in it, but a more kind of communitarian form of conservatism, and someone who before that at the Centre for Social Justice has done some brilliant work on what it means to strengthen community and actually how we can harness communities, empower communities to do much more themselves. Our penultimate speaker will be Richard Taylor from the Post Office, who is someone we've worked with in the past, someone who can speak, I guess, from a perhaps more corporate perspective about the role of the Post Office and some of the evolution of the Post Office in the last few years in sustaining community and the kind of network that you oversee. And then we will come to Richard Fleetwood, who is a postmaster, who can give the real life experience of what it means to manage a local asset within a community and to adapt as times do change in order to serve that community well and ensure that the people and communities are kind of connected and thriving rather than feeling threatened and like they're being left behind. So a fantastic panel, a large panel, so I'm going to ask all of our speakers to keep their remarks to 5 minutes or so as directed, and then we will have Q&A from the audience. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Robert Buckland. Robert.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Will, for that very warm introduction. And can I apologise in advance that I can't stay for all the meeting. I have another engagement to go to, which is particularly unfortunate because I do want to hear the debate as it develops. I think a good place to start, actually, would be the Levelling Up White Paper. A new government doesn't mean that levelling up somehow is no longer important. certainly is. And when you look at that white paper, you'll see one of the important focus areas is the empowerment of local leaders and communities, especially in those places lacking local agency. That's an important phrase, with a mission to deliver devolution deals, etc. Let's put that sort of process thing to one side. We can debate mayors and on another occasion. This is about local agency, it seems to me. And I think all of us who've been in elected office, council and indeed at MP level, will have experience of how even in our own constituencies and wards, that local agency can vary hugely. So I represent South Swindon. It is a microcosm of the country. I've got wards with a very dense middle class population where independent shops are flourishing. The street where I have my constituency office in Old Town is transformed the last 10 years with a number of exciting independent eateries, clothes shops, delicatessens, the sort of diversity that I think can make us quite optimistic about the future of the high street. And yet there are other parts of my constituency where there isn't that local agency, where we do struggle in terms of local leadership. And I'll give you a very good example. One of my communities won big lottery funding 10 years ago. It's proved very difficult to work out precisely how to use that substantial amount of money for the benefit of the community. It's taken us years to focus upon a project that will be long lasting. Inflation has started to eat into that money, but we felt it was very important that the community had something that was being done with them rather than to them or for them, and that is an example of how a process can perhaps take an inordinately long time. And then there are other good examples of the hub model, which can be led perhaps by a local authority or indeed by local support agencies coming together. And in Swindon we were very much ahead of our time when the CAB, the Law Centre, the Swindon Carers Centre and other important organisations came together in a disused school, which is now a really much valued hub offering wraparound services for people who will often present with one issue but will soon turn to other agencies because of course their issues are complicated and multifaceted. It's great to have the Post Office represented here today. I spend a lot of time talking to the Post Office because we're in an era where there is government commitment to a post office network, and the coalition government, which I was a part of, committed a large amount of money to achieve that. We were coming to the end of the last Labour government where we were losing post offices because there wasn't the funding. The issue isn't government will or political support. The issue is being able to physically get people to run post offices, and I think that's the big challenge. It's great to have a postmaster with us today because he'll know from his own experience that it is a vocation. It's not like a job like any others. You end up being social worker, carer, agony aunt. You do it all, and I think that's a particularly onerous and difficult task, which is why perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised when I talk to my friends in the post office and it sometimes proves very difficult to identify suitable alternatives to postal services that sadly are having to close. Certainly that's my experience in and around Swindon, but I do think that the co-location of services like post offices is clearly a no-brainer if we are to make them survive and thrive, because we will need them and they will certainly be an invaluable resource for the community. And I'll end on this note. As Welsh Secretary, it's been a particular pleasure of mine to actually start to see how government funding can make a difference in left behind communities. And only the other day I was up in Ebervale, which many of you will know is at the heads of the valleys, very much a community that saw its industrial heyday in the last century, which has historically been left behind by economic and technological development, getting direct support from the UK Community Renewal Fund, and that is hundreds of thousands of pounds of resource being put into the Ebervale Institute, which itself is now a hub for domestic abuse services, drug abuse services, other types of advice, all co-located located in this historic building. So it's happening even in our most challenged communities. And the sense of energy I got from this project was really tangible. So many reasons to be cheerful, but I do think there are models out there that we need to look at. It's now about sharing best practice, and believe you me, government will continue, as long as I'm there and other colleagues, provide that political will to actually empower different communities to reach solutions in their own way that allow renewal with these important services at the heart of that action.
Robert, thank you so much. A very, very strong statement there from you that Levelling Up is alive and well. Rumours of its demise are much exaggerated, and that local agency is crucial to continuing to deliver it. So a really fantastic way to start this event, and thank you for that. Lots of things that you said I'd like to pick up in the ensuing discussion, but I'm going to move on to our next speaker, Miriam.
Thank you. And actually what I was going to say fits very well with how you ended on post-industrial areas. So my constituency, Penistone and Stocksbridge, north of Sheffield. I have Stocksbridge, a steel town, very much a post-industrial area. So in its heyday, in the past, Stocksbridge Steelworks employed 11,000 people. The Steelworks was responsible not just for the economic heart of the town, providing really well-paid, secure jobs that had status in the community. The Steelworks also built civic assets, the football club, the golf club, town centres, that kind of thing. Really important civic assets that were the heart and soul of the community and of social cohesion. Now, fast forward to today, the Steelworks employs just 750 people. They are still very good jobs. They pay 50% above the local average wage, but they're obviously very, very few. And of course, the civic institutions that went with the Steelworks have also understandably declined. Many people have to leave Stocksbridge for work. That's increasingly difficult as bus services are cut. And it's a town that very much has declined from its heyday. And you can see that in the high street where many shops are shut. There's no sixth form or any further education, post-16 education in the town at all. It's very much not where it was. Now, we've talked about levelling up and some of the things the government's doing. There is, in the process of being, a success story in Stocksbridge. So back in 2019, in the summer, Stocksbridge was chosen as one of the 101 towns for the government's Towns Fund programme. And this is a really innovative idea because unlike many other central government pots of funding, we did not have to bid for it. So far too often, I think, local communities, particularly deprived ones, have to compete with each other for pots of funding. And they put hundreds and thousands of man hours and resources into writing these bids, and then they're unsuccessful. And that's frankly unsustainable for some communities. But the Towns Fund was different. We were offered £25 million that was ours, ring-fenced, as long as we could come up with a good way of spending it to regenerate the town. And again, a really innovative model. The chair of the board, we had to set up a local board, so it wasn't just up to the local authority, Sheffield, who forget about Stocksbridge frequently, which is partly why it's a left-behind town. The board was chaired by myself, local MP, a representative from the private sector, and then any stakeholders in the community that we felt were right for the job. So charities, sports, schools, local business people. And it's taken us a while, as you might imagine, with the pandemic and everything, but we have come up with 8 really strong projects, all of which have been given the green light by government to regenerate the town, and we're awaiting any day the cheque to come through and for us to be able to put spades in the ground. But when we first started the Towns Fund initiative, the first thing we did was to go out to consultation with the community. Now, there are a lot of things wrong with Stocksbridge, as I've just described, but it was fascinating, the results that came back, because almost everybody mentioned the high street. Now, you might not think the high street is all that important in the modern day. You know, lots of these services can be had online. There's all sorts of other issues in Stocksbridge, antisocial behaviour, housing, those kind of things. But the high street and how to get to it were the main focus of people's complaints. So Stocksbridge is about this steep. It's great for leafleting. You lose weight really, really, really fast. But it's really difficult to get to up and down the hill, particularly if you're elderly. And there are no buses anymore, really, from the high street to up the hill. So the high street and how to get to it was one of people's main concerns, which just shows that there is something about the high street, the look of it, the kind of resources that are there, the kind of services are there that really add to people's sense of community and pride about the place. And so we've hopefully, fingers crossed, because inflation has also torn a hole in our plans, we are going to deliver a really important improvement to the high street. We're going to rebuild one of the buildings there and make it a community hub so that we can have a business services there, hopefully a pop-up bank. These things aren't sustainable in the long term now, but a pop-up service, pop-up financial services, investment in new business, community hub, adult education, and then use a lot of the rest of the money for a shopfront scheme, basically to tart up a row of very nasty 1960s derelict shops, and that will just improve the look of it and improve this sense of pride. So ask me back in 3 years and I'll tell you how successful it's been, but it was absolutely fascinating that it was those kind of communal assets that people really focused in on. But I think the turning point for Stocksbridge actually came a few years ago when the local council, Sheffield City Council, decided to close down the Stocksbridge Leisure Centre. Now, the Leisure Centre in Stocksbridge was built by public subscription. And so in the 60s, people went around literally door to door collecting subscriptions from the community, and they built it themselves. So when the council decided to close it down because it was losing hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, there was a real anger in the community because they weren't just losing an asset, they were losing their asset, something that they were invested in, something they had literally bought into. Now, in a lot of towns like Stocksbridge that become quite depressed, quite economically depressed, as well as kind of from a sense of lack of hope, but a few people in the community decided to stand against this. They joined with some local charities and eventually managed to save the Leisure Centre, and it's now being run as a community interest company. It's making money, it's had more grants for more improvements, it's running social prescribing, and I think that was the turning point for the town because it gave people this sense of agency, that decline wasn't inevitable and that they could take things into their own hands. And I think the Towns Fund on top of that will establish this sense that Stocksbridge holds its own destiny, and let's see, we've got a long way to go in terms of an economic heart of the town, but I think it shows that things can be turned around. But I think in post-industrial areas where there isn't the competence, there isn't the economic capital, they do need intervention, but it has to be the right kind of intervention. A hand up, not a hand out, we often say, but the Towns Fund is an ideal example of that. Putting the money out there, but giving the people the power to spend it. And so I suppose I'll just finish by saying, because I know plenty of people want to get in, but I think that civic assets are really important, but even more important are the people who build and maintain them. And I think sometimes it doesn't really matter what those assets are. It's more about a sense of shared identity, a common purpose. So in the village where I live, which is 5 miles down the road from Stocksbridge, we don't have a lot in the way of assets in terms of the type of assets, but we do have a park, we have a school, we have a church, and we have some pubs. And that's enough. That's enough for people to get around. We've got Friends of the Park, we've got a brass band. You just need a focus for the community in order to be able to build that sense of pride.
Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to hear such a local perspective, and I'm just really struck by the words that people are using. I mean, the word hub has come up about 12 times already. The word pride you mentioned several times there, Miriam. Just a very clear sense that this is an emotional subject as well as an economic or social one. Robert, you need to leave. But thank you so much for sparing the time.
Thank you very much, and I will second Miriam's point because my experience with the Swindon Towns Fund has been identical.
Right.
Private sector leadership, specified point of contact in government, one civil servant working with us, that's allowed project delivery. It's a really good model, and it's much better than these tenders and pots that we've had in the past that are too disparate. But I leave it there, and forgive me.
No, fantastic. Robert, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Peter.
Thanks all. Yeah, as Will said, it's not necessarily a particularly FT subject, community spirit, towns funds, regeneration. But I think the reason actually the FT is writing about it is because this is increasingly part of the sort of social safety net and increasingly part of the political landscape in a way that it wasn't 25, 30 years ago. And I guess I would say that for every, and Robert made this point about local agency, for every uplifted story about leisure centres being rebuilt, there are an awful lot of places that are left behind, right? And so if the approach now is to have more engagement from parish councils, more community spirit, more Burke's little platoons, I think you have to think really hard about what you do about those areas that can't get people together to work out how to spend their big local £1 million grant, because as both of the two previous speakers have said, social capital, social infrastructure is incredibly unevenly distributed. There's quite good research actually about the levels, for example, of charitable donations that left behind areas get average about £7 compared to a national average of about £12. And when you get to the 225 most left behind, plenty of them per capita average donations £5, which is £7.30 odd less than everyone else is getting as a rule. So I think if that's the model we're going into the biggest cost of living squeeze since the war. The current government is determined to cut back taxes. The 45 pence U-turn is £2 billion. There were £45 billion worth. I'm talking to people in Whitehall who are being told to get the scalpels out. Right, we had a decade of austerity. There's another massive round of retrenchment coming in public services, in public cuts, if that's the way they want to manage it. But let's see how far they get pushed back. But nobody should be under any illusion about what that's going to mean in local areas and what that's going to mean for the most left behind areas. And so I know lots of people want to say, so I would just finish by saying that if this is going to be the approach, I think you have to think really hard about how you intervene in those areas that demonstrably don't have the social capital to restart their leisure centre, because I'm very conflicted about this. I'm not try and get a parking permit off the local council. That's clearly not a good delivery mechanism. I was in the Isle of Sheppey just recently, incredible support bus that was laid on, if you look at the logos on the side of the bus, by kind of a holy trinity times 3 of the local academy school that was very proactive, had lots of kids that coming to school without food, the Sally Army, the Citizens Advice Bureau, the local government, the parish council, the local MP, everybody pitching in, a local company that gave the bus. Brilliant uplifting story in Sheppey, one of the most left behind areas in the country. But if you don't have that, then you're just left behind. So there's talk about social infrastructure funds, where you've got money that you can target. I think devolution is incredibly important. These competitive pots of money that everyone just gets lost in this incredibly frustrating bureaucracy where you spend lots of time and effort getting plans together that then don't go forward. I like the idea, which we've heard from this government, of consolidating a lot of these pots and pushing it downstream. And then I think we have to try and think of a way, either done via devolution, so into the main combined authorities or mayoral authorities, or into Whitehall, of engaging parish councils, the charitable sector. I was on a Fabian Society panel at the Labour Party conference. Real frustration that the sector's got not really taken seriously, when actually increasingly it's providing a lot of co-support in these areas. And I think if this is the model we're going to, and I have to say, looking at the public finances, even this government aside, I think we're going to need more and more of this. There needs to be a really strategic thought about how it doesn't actually entrench inequality. I used to work in the States, and you go to bits of Pennsylvania and Ohio, the old Rust Belt, etc., and there's some amazing volunteering, there's some amazing philanthropy, which we don't have a tradition of in this country, but there's also some absolutely desperately left behind places, and we need to make sure that we don't fall down that rabbit hole, in my view.
Peter, thank you very much. Some words of warning, very useful. Could I now turn to Imogen?
Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me. I depend so much on Onward's research, and forever WhatsApping Will saying, that citation, that reference, what is it? And he's going, it's my work, it's our work. So thanks so much to your amazing team for all the work they do, and we steal it and put it in our reports, which I'm going to talk about in just a sec, with Will's permission. But no, this is such an important event, because it places the big and important things at the centre of policy, and that is what we're terming social infrastructure these days: post offices, town halls, shops on the high street, youth clubs, pitches, that sort of stuff. And the focus for the new social covenant unit, particularly this conference for us, our comms, has been around a simple message, which is that the foundations of prosperity are in the households and the communities. The foundations of prosperity are in the households and the communities. So we need socially resilient people who are able to feel like they belong somewhere, to feel happy, to feel safe, and are able to participate and contribute to the formal economy. And that's the work of the households and the communities. And I just think it's so vital that whenever we talk about the economy, which we're doing endlessly at the moment, we don't forget that actually there's a whole other side to life, and it's in the community and in the households, and it's where people live and have their being. So as I said, with Will's permission, I'll refrain from sticking my reports on the back there, but if you'd like one, I brought some along, been lugging them around. Yesterday evening we launched this report. It's authored by a dozen Conservative MPs. It's called Social Capitalism, How a Community-Powered Economy Drives Growth, and it makes the case for exactly as I've just been saying, that if we want a strong economy, we need a strong society as well. And then a slightly more philosophical piece, this is our manifesto, written by myself, Miriam, and Miriam's colleague Danny Kruger. This is slightly broader, so it talks about the need for strong families, strong communities and a strong nation. It's the job of government, we feel, to create the conditions of belonging and responsibility. That's how individuals become happy, safe and free. It's not just a state or market solution. It's something different. So do badge me at the end for one of those. I'd love to get rid of them, because otherwise I've got to drive them back down to London. So we bang on about, as I say, pubs, libraries, town halls, sports pitches, etc. And people go, oh, that's nice. And I'm going, no, it's not just nice, it's absolutely vital. These are the big, important things that Onward and we attempt to put at the heart of the policy discussion. We call it social infrastructure, which is a kind of very technocratic way of saying gathering places, places where people interact. Perhaps it's because we've been trying to get the ideas being taken more seriously, so we feel we've got to drum up some kind of technocratic language. But social infrastructure, that is what generates social capital, as Peter was just talking about earlier. So it's the places where people are able to purposefully participate, realise a responsibility, cultivate belonging, and post offices are just those places. And clearly, as Miriam's mentioned and gave a really good example of, we've seen pressures on the high street pose a challenge to post offices and other elements of our social infrastructure. But I think there are solutions, and some of them have already been mentioned, things like the co-location of services. We haven't talked about community ownership so much. Actually, Miriam, you did touch on it, but I'll stop in a minute because I'm worried that if I say too much, I'll have nothing to contribute in the Q&A, which is always my problem. But as I was preparing for this, I came across some research by the RSA, and they talked. They found that posties are familiar strangers. They refer to them. Posties are familiar strangers, and they found that local people better recognise and value people like postmen and women than they do their local councillors. And I just thought that just says it all. You know, these people that are out there in the community are so meaningful for local people, particularly those who are vulnerable and disadvantaged and might need signposting to certain services. So I just thought that was really prominent. So people need social infrastructure and they want it, and we need to help them to keep it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Imogen. And I, having heard ministers speak on platforms talking about the need for government to create the conditions for growth, it's very nice to hear someone talking about the need for government to create the conditions for a strong social fabric too, because you're totally right, the two go hand in hand, and there is a role for government in creating those conditions. Richard,
thank you.
To you.
Yeah,
the first of two Richards.
I mean, very much is a role for government in that social infrastructure and economic infrastructure. So we're here thinking about what it is to be at the heart of community and what it is to be a local asset. Well, post office is actually a government asset, which is at the heart of the community. So we have 11,500 post offices across all 4 nations of the United Kingdom. We are in every community, and that level of 11,500 post offices has been stable for the last 10 years, so since 2010, 2011 and separation from Royal Mail. So, but as Robert observed, there is churn within that, and finding good people to be postmasters, like Richard, who you're going to hear from next, is challenging, and we want those people to be those social entrepreneurs in those communities. And it really is, thinking about the Levelling Up White Paper, an opportunity to be an exemplar of pride of place. And we see that specifically in that local asset. So if we just think about the post office, we did some research a couple of years ago now with Public First, and just thinking about the post office, 1 in 3 of our customers will always go and shop somewhere else when they come to the post office. So they will go to a cafe, they will go to a nearby shop. So if you think about an asset, you want a return on that asset, you're getting that straight away, and that generates some extra 400 million additional visits to local shops and at least £1 billion of discretionary spend. So that's in its own right. But more importantly, that actually some of the services which are going to be so important to places like Stocksbridge. So for example, if we think about cash and banking, here is a startling figure, and apologies to anybody who is a banker here in the room, but 5,000 retail bank branches have closed in the last 7 years. Yeah, that's 50 a month at the moment. And you're going to hear from Richard, because Richard operates what are called banking hubs. There's only 2 in the country. They're both operated by Richard. So he'll tell you more about them. But there's only 2, and they're closing 50 branches a month. So one of the ways in which we need to get serious is to invest in these local assets quickly, because certainly I'm sure in somewhere like Stocksbridge, your pride of place in your high street will be if there's something which looks and feels like a bank, because that's really important to people to be able to live their lives. Just another little stat for you. So if you think about post office, we tended to be a sort of cash out business. So we were the places where no doubt your grandparents came to get their pension in cash, and we still do a lot of that. But actually now we're also a cash in business. So within political debates, people often talk about access to cash. We're interested in the whole cash cycle. Not only do you want to be able to withdraw it, which you can do free of charge at the post office, but you also need to be able to spend it. And it's all very well for people like us who can just wave our cards at places where they don't take cash anymore. But lots of people are excluded from that.
Yeah.
They can't actually spend their cash.
Yeah.
And if you're a local business where you are taking cash, you then want to be able to deposit it. Remember that figure? 5,000 bank branches closed? You don't want to close your business to have to drive 10, 20, 30 miles to a town to deposit cash in a bank. You want to do that in something that looks and feels like a bank locally. And where we've seen that, Richard will tell you more, there is much more economic rejuvenation. So lots of opportunity there. And then there's the unseen part of it. So if we think about post-pandemic, people are now living and working in places which perhaps lots of people have moved. They've moved to new communities. And if you want to start a business, you can do that anywhere in the country, as long as you can do some cash and banking and you can access markets around the UK, around the world, thanks to a post office. The key question is, how do we sustain it? And we are a government asset in all of these communities in very hard financial times, and sustaining 11,500 branches is very difficult. So we can't take it for granted, and maybe we can talk about that in the discussion.
Fantastic, Richard. Thank you very much. Well, now you've teed up Richard brilliantly. So, Richard,
No
tell us about.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So, myself and my family business started 2 years ago with one post office, and we now run 8 post offices, and as was very kindly introduced, the only 2 community bank clubs in the whole of the UK. We go from Glasgow down to Essex, and we've got stores in the northeast of England, and you see very similar themes from communities and from business in all of the areas that we serve, really. The thing about supporting local business is huge. One of the areas that we have got a post office has qualified for levelling up funding, and the council said actually a core part of our regeneration, our levelling up, is the post office, because we know that drives footfall to the high street. Other people have told us that, other businesses have told us that. In terms of the bank hubs as well, we've seen that where new businesses have opened because we've came to town. We've seen some of those businesses that were going to be card only, when we went in and visited them and said, actually, you don't need to shut at 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock to get to the bank to bank your take-ins. You can stay open all day and just drop your take-ins in with us when it's convenient for you. That's changed their business model. We've now got businesses in Rochford that are 30 and 40% cash, which, yes, it's great to sustain the cash out model, but actually if you've got businesses that won't take it, you're going to kind of go drive a cashless society through the back door. And I was at a talk last week about crypto and Bitcoin and things like that, which evolution and revolution is fantastic, but exclusion or inclusion for the millions of people out there that still do live day to day We have customers already that are breaking open their piggy banks to pay their gas and electric bills on prepayment meters, and the feedback that we get that just says, thank God you guys are here. When the banks have closed, particularly with the bank hubs, we've got people that are saying it's an hour and a half or 2 hours round trip on the bus to go and pay a bill or go and take cash out. So it's not just the cost of living; people are time poor. We're busy. Could you imagine if you had to take 2 hours out of your day to just go and pay your rent or something like that? It's a huge difference that it makes to people locally, and it gives them pride that there's things that they can do together, and it doesn't necessarily always have to be about the big projects or the money. It can be something as simple as, and I'll be honest, I learned it from Rochford Council, was things like dressing windows up at Christmas and running competitions about which store's got the best dressed window, because it brought people in, it gave people an excitement and a buzz about the town that actually we've mirrored up north in some of my stores, in some of the areas where we've had high streets that are struggling, and we said, look, the town does a Christmas tree, but actually what do we do? And it brought a lot of the local businesses closer together, whereas before we thought we were fighting over the same money. There was a set amount of money in the town, and we said, actually, if they go and spend at your shop, they're not spending in mine. But we said, actually, if we work together on it and we create a buzz about the town, rather than the conversation of, oh look, there's another shop closed, this place is really going downhill, and change that mindset and that perception that actually there's something happening here and something going on. That for me is one way to really sort of change the future of those smaller towns and high streets that do seem to be struggling. I think one thing that probably from our point of view is some of our post offices are subsidised to keep them open, and they without that would be loss making. One of the stores that we took on was a store that was losing about £1,500 a month. They were turning the lights off to save the electric, and this was 2 years ago. They didn't have hot water because they couldn't afford the bill back then, and even things like sanitary bins and stuff like that, it was just what costs can we cut to make it sustainable or viable. One of the things that could make a huge difference on that is that store, for example, when we took it on, 1/3 of the revenue was going on business rates. Now you think for an asset such as the post office, that could be something that it doesn't just do post or banking or bill payments. It can be people asking what time the library's open or what time. The questions that you get, you have to be a fountain of knowledge, and my team do an incredible job of knowing when the next bus is going to be, redirecting people to and we've had cases of, we've helped customers out domestic abuse, we've helped people go to local food banks, link up with local councils and things like that, and it's the challenge is a lot of those things that my team do, which we would encourage them to do every day of the week to support the community. I think we need to link up better with local council and say, actually, how can we support that, but also do it in a way that potentially could generate revenue for post office branches as well. There are things already that people have mentioned, like parking permits, like things like that actually, is that something that post office could get involved with as a front office of government? We've seen things where there's delays with passports and things like that over the last few months. Post offices already do those services. So what can we do to further our relation with government as a government asset to say, actually, there's opportunities here to empower and grow those local assets further.
Richard, thank you so much. I love that idea of kind of expanding the role of the post office as the front office of government in the community at a point where government is actually retreating, and as we've heard, the private sector is also retreating, as Richard said. Fantastic. So we've got around about 20 minutes left, and I'm conscious that we've heard lots from the panel, but we haven't heard anything yet from you. So if people would like to ask questions, please raise your hand. I might take a couple at a time. So we've got a gentleman in the fourth row back, and then a woman immediately behind him. We'll just take those two, and then I'll come to some of the others. So, yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Doris Metterling. I'll say in a minute where I'm from, but I also want to know how Richard turned the shop around, if he has so far. The 1,500 quid loss, how he turned that into a non-loss, if they put it like that. So that's the first thing. And the second point I want to make is I live in the middle of a very large town that's very lively, but we have the same sort of problem. Post office is closing. In the last 10 years, well, 2 have closed. Well, forget about the one. I appreciate why they're closing, because the needs have changed. But there's one which, in the neighbouring borough, so I don't know all the details, but it was very controversial, reconstruction, rebuilding of the area of that side of the street. But they wanted to put a post office back because people want it. Now, maybe they want it without actually needing it, because you know what I mean? It's like closing a library nobody uses, but then they start getting up and saying, why are you closing the library? But it's important. So it's interesting to know what we can do, even in the centre, and that's London I'm talking about. What we can do in the centre of London to keep post office open as hubs. I've got one quite near me, which does do other things besides selling stamps and passports. But they actually did more stuff, and they're doing less again. They're back to more to the core service. They seem to be very busy. I mean, I'm there sometimes to make a payment or whatever. So first of all, thank you. How did you turn the shop around?
So Richard, if you could hold that question for one moment in your mind, I'm going to come to the woman behind and just take a couple of questions at the same time.
Yes. I live near what my husband now still calls the village. It's part of an outer suburb of Poole. And if I go into my bank, which is now going to be the last one on our little high street, and they tell me that I can do that transaction online one more time, I'm going to tell them I'm doing it to keep their job, because actually, I know I can do it online, but I feel if I don't go and lose it, it will be lost for other people. That's just a by the way. I don't think they're helping each other themselves at all, but never mind. But it's a little bit like this gentleman said, is that you consult people, and I used to be a counsellor, you consult people and say, what do you want, why, and they go, oh, we haven't got this, they haven't got that, and then you start to provide it, and they don't use it. Everybody says they want a local bus, don't we? Who gets on the local bus? Okay, unless you've really, really got a need and it's the simplest journey for you. You don't. You just like to think it's there in case you need it. And in terms of like the library, the council, when I started as a councillor, we removed the mobile library. Everybody said they wanted to keep it. When we asked them why the people who used it, 50% drove to it, and a quarter of them wanted to go and chat to the driver because he'd been doing it for so long, and the driver wants to retire. So there's, when you ask people what they want and you want to provide it, how do you take them to be the horse to make them drink again?
Yeah. So that's a very, very good question. So I'm going to come to Richard first, and then I'm going to come to a couple of the panellists on that second question. But Richard, do you want to come?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Turned around the shop.
It probably actually is very similar to what a lot of people have said, is actually just listen to what people are saying or wanting in the area. Particularly in some of the areas that we have, they don't have the luxury of being able to afford a car to drive out of the town or the village into the city and things like that. And they say we see these things that like people can buy 5 miles, 10 miles down the road and we can't get access to it. Now, some of that could be something as simple as newspapers. They said actually there's nowhere that does newspapers, there's nowhere that does magazines, there's nowhere that does photocopying, or if I wanted to get my passport done, I need a photo, and where do I get that done? So there was 101 things that we probably introduced from a retail perspective when people are talking about co-locations and things like that. I think it's very important to remind people that when you go into a post office, the majority of them are postmasters and they're franchises, and actually a lot of the time it's the retail that helps. A successful retail makes a successful post office. And we learned very quickly, there was one of the first stores we did, it was a nice affluent student area of Newcastle where we did zero waste and plastic free and things like that. That price point didn't work very well in some of our more low gem areas, so we very quickly had to learn that wasn't the way to turn it round. It is engaging with customers as well, because one of the stores that we did, we were paying, it was losing £100,000 a year because it was rent and rates. So we relocated it to a small unit to reduce the rent, reduce the rates. Got a lot of pushback from the local community because it's a busy post office, probably similar to the one that you're talking about in central London. But when we explained, it was, there's a phrase in the North East which kind of out and out. We said, look, the reason we've had to do this is to keep a post office in the area, and without that, actually, it might have been a very different conversation that we were having. We've extended the opening hours, so some of our stores are now open 7 days a week, so we're there when people want and need us. And it was really by kind of taking that feedback on board, that we started to turn things around very quickly. And to go to the lady's point as well about people sort of saying, oh, you can do that online and things like that. There was a customer in one of our bank hubs that asked one of our banking colleagues if she was a turkey, which I thought was a very weird question. But she said, only turkeys vote for Christmas. Why are you sending everybody online? The reason I'm coming in here is because I want this place to stay. I'm not using the ATM. I'm waiting because we were trying, help with the queue and things like that. I said, no. I want my transaction to matter and I want my transaction to count. So it was educating people around things like that in the local community as well, that says, actually, all of these things work together to keep us here for you and keep us successful, really.
Thank you very much, Richard. Miriam, can I come to you next on this kind of fascinating question about how do you marry what people say they want with what they really want and kind of bridge that gap? And I might come to Peter after that, actually, just given some of the work that you've done.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question, and I think that the example about local bus services is absolutely true. We're going through this in my constituency at the moment. A local bus service is being cut. People are very upset about it for understandable reasons, but the actual figures are that passenger numbers are only 70% of pre-pandemic levels. In fact, for bus pass users, it's under 60%. People aren't using it, and to be credit to the bus company, they've done as well as they can to keep a service going when it's not particularly viable. But people say, I want to know it's there if I need it. And of course, that's a completely understandable point of view from a human perspective. But these things have to be financially sustainable. And I think I'm nervous about trying to go back to a model that once worked. So a permanent bank that's open 5 days a week, rather than a hub model or an entrepreneurial, way of doing things, which I think is the way we should be going. Because I think we've got to acknowledge our entire way of life has changed. I mean, in the 1950s, women didn't work. So you've got half the population who are your footfall for your high street. We don't have that anymore. We don't have the footfall on our high street, except perhaps in these more well-off upper middle class areas that Robert was talking about at the beginning, where perhaps you do have women and retired people with disposable income who can make those high streets work. We are incredibly time poor. If you think about the percentage of the population that now works and how many hours those people work, I mean, you're going to not like this, but the other day I was extremely busy between meetings. I didn't have a stamp, and instead of going into the post office, I went online and printed one out. Sorry, but because I genuinely, but that is how that I know I should have admitted that. And I felt really bad. I thought I want to support the post office, but I don't have time to park up, to go to the post office, go in. Also, our local post office postmaster is a very good salesman, and I always come out with cheese. But yeah, we have to recognise that our way of life has changed. Now, personally, I think the answer to this is to stop forcing everybody into the workplace and actually have a much more sustainable model of living, because our current model isn't really working. Our public services are at breaking point. And if you think what the welfare state was created, when it was created in that time, 1947, when women didn't work, when there was no state paid for childcare, no state paid for social care, only basic level of healthcare, what we're expecting the state to do now, that the community used to do for free, it has become unsustainable. So we're going to have to move back to a model of the community, of the social infrastructure providing some of this care. And if we get that right, if we enable people to look after each other, then we will have more people in those local communities able to be the footfall. But I think we've got a long way to go, and in the meantime I think we've just got to be pragmatic, and I love those kind of ideas, rather than trying to say let's get a bank back. It's not going to happen. We need to be practical.
Fantastic. Going to come to Peter next, if that's okay.
The thing I don't understand is how the post office can be losing money when you look at the price of stamps now. But I mean, but seriously, actually, to the lady's question about how do you make people drink, the answer is you're not going to make people drink. What's interesting to me actually, and I hadn't really thought about this, is that actually what we're really talking about is these places being open for people who are to some degree marginalised or disadvantaged, elderly, right? Most people don't want to go near a bank. The only time I've been near a bank in the last 5 years was when I remortgaged and I had to take my passport down to Santander Bank, and it took the queue was round the block, completely miserable, right? So banks are, the banks are disappearing. I live in Brighton, and there's I live in a prosperous bit of Brighton. There's a, parade of shops. Five Ways is up there. It's full. The Barclays Bank or whatever's gone, and it's now a coffee shop. And actually, nobody complained. And so maybe, I mean, I don't think we can, try and create worlds that don't exist, right? So in the sense of the service needs to be there. Either it's a community hub and it's subsidised by the government to look after people who, really can't manage online banking, like my mother, who lives in darkest Shropshire, and really drives her nuts. But it is essentially now becoming. And even she actually has got so bored of waiting. I mean, even she's got the iPad out, and God knows where she sent the money to. But anyway, I just agree. I just think we have to be realistic. We can't live in this sort of warm beer and cricket. Great game, cricket. But we have to be realistic, and therefore the hubs, I think, is a brilliant, an obvious and brilliant solution. Well, as long as all the banks participate. Do they?
Yeah, so I mean, the way it kind of works is we run the counter service day to day, and then we get the 5 largest banks in the area. For example, you might get NatWest on a Monday, Lloyds on a Tuesday, Santander on a Wednesday.
Okay.
So day to day, if someone wants to come in and take the cash out, deposit, checks is huge, and particularly if you get someone under 30, they're coming with a scrap of paper and don't know what they've even got in their hands.
I mean, when did the last time anyone wrote a cheque?
But you'd be surprised, actually.
Really?
It surprises me the number. The hundreds we kind of go through a week still. But
yeah. But over time, that is going to be disappearing, isn't it?
There's also an interesting thing that just occurred to me is just on the subject of libraries. So I know I've never used my local library until I had a child, and then I use my library every Saturday morning.
Yeah.
And so there is something about actually. That's not a financial revenue-based service. That's not something that's actually you can't measure the monetary value of that, but that is something that has inherent value.
I lived in a village in New Zealand with a library, exactly like that. But parents came, coffee. There was a coffee shop. It was a hub,
Yeah, exactly. So, Richard, you wanted to clarify one thing.
Just to show you how complex these things are. So, the post office is a government asset. We do shops. We're not the Royal Mail, which is a publicly listed company. They set the prices of stamps, not us. And if you buy them online, they give you a discount because they're
printing it yourself, though.
You're printing it yourself, but also you're cutting out the post office. So these things are complicated. Okay,
Really?
they're just more straightforward. Just a little, I know. That's why I was kind of sucking my teeth. Just every action has consequences.
I'll be really brief. I'll be really brief.
Okay.
No, just to say to the lady's point, I think local people are fearful that remote bureaucracy is going to take away things they love, and so they have this kind of preemptive. Yes, I want my buses. Yes, I want my banks. Yes, of course, because often the consultation process is so. Well, local people might call it a sham. These conversations are not the long and frankly protracted conversations that they should be, where proper local engagement is taking place. So I think people just, without even thinking, say absolutely want to keep our banks because they're not being engaged with properly by local council, whatever authority it might be. And I think that's why we get some of those attitudes.
Thank you. So I'm going to take 2 very quick questions. So I'm going to go to the people. I'm going to go to the people who already had their hands up. So there was a gentleman at the back and the gentleman on the 3rd row, and then we're going to wrap up. So gentleman at the back.
Thank you, Nick Phillips, the Almshouse Association. And I'd like to ask the panel whether they feel that there's a place now in these communities for philanthropy, and if so, how it could be encouraged at a local level. We've seen a bit about how it's driven from the community, but there is a funding gap, and I think Peter just mentioned philanthropy very briefly. So is that part of the solution?
Fantastic, thank you very much.
I'm Theo Clay. I work for an organisation called NPC. We do research on charities and the voluntary sector. And we've had a lot about community assets and fantastic services that happen there. But it's often the latter of those that gets forgotten. The money to maintain the assets, to be able to kind of deliver work there that serves the community. And we did some polling last year that showed that when you ask people what they want leveled up in their area, they list reduce poverty, reduce homelessness, reduce crime, which all needs to happen in conjunction with but in things like the Levelling Up Fund and the Community Renewal Fund, we don't see a lot of focus on that. So I just want to know, how do we ensure that the assets actually serve communities alongside those services?
Fantastic. I'm going to split up the answers to those questions because we don't have time for everyone to answer all of them. So I'm going to come to Miriam and Peter first, then Miriam on philanthropy, because I think both of you have probably got interesting things to say about that. And then I'm going to come to our remaining three panellists on how do you link those assets with those real outcomes you're trying to see in communities. So Peter, could I start with you?
So, very quickly, I used to work in the States for 3 or 4 years, and it is incredible the difference. Part of not having a sort of developed social welfare system, and even actually our social welfare system is crumbling in lots of ways, but we still live on this sort of post-war, world that we the NHS, etc., even though it's all kind of falling around our ears, we still kind of believe in it notionally. And I think we have to have a real conversation of what I was saying earlier about if we're going to have a world which is based more on philanthropy and community work, where and part of that is getting high net worth individuals to think hard about donating. And I can tell you actually that the donations from high net worth individuals are going down. I was sat on a panel with Nicole Sykes from the Pro Bono Economics, and one thing you can do, a bit like when you're trying to green the mortgage book, is when people remortgage, you say, have you thought about taking some money out, do your windows and get your heat pump? One thing you can do is get financial advisors, when they're giving annual tax advice, to say to people, have you thought about, because the last thing I'll say is, when you were in America, I once met a guy and he failed to invest in a company, and if he'd invested in it, it would have been a big risk at the time, but he'd be worth $700 million now, he said. And I said, do you regret that? He said, no. He said, I retired, I made $3 million a year, absolutely happy as that. He said, the thing I regret, I always never forget this, about not making the $700 million is what I could have done with it. And Americans think like that, make a pile, great, but most of them want their name on the library or the whatever, and I don't know how you get that culture going, but we need to.
Yep. Very.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And whilst the welfare state has many, many advantages, and I think most of us in this country wouldn't want an American system in terms of the healthcare, insurance, those kind of things, it does have disadvantages too. And I think one of those is that people think that the poor, the disadvantaged, are not their problem, that it's somebody else's responsibility, it's the state's responsibility, that they can outsource generosity. Whereas if they know there's not that safety net, or less of a safety net, people are much more incentivised and much more driven to step in and help. So I think that's one problem with the welfare state, is that people have no longer think it's their responsibility. Secondly, I think the problem with philanthropy in this country particularly is that we're so geographically unequal. All the people with money are in the southeast, all the people who need it are in the north. And I've got an absolutely incredible residential adult further education college in my constituency, based in an old stately home, that does absolutely amazing work, taking adults who need a second chance in education. They've been in prison, they've been victims of abuse, they've been drug addicts, and giving them qualifications, and their outcomes are incredible. It needs some money, and I can't find anyone to save it. Now, I know if I lived in London or the South East and someone connected somehow with that college, it's only a few £1 million. It's not a lot of money in the scheme of things, but there's nobody from South Yorkshire who's wealthy. And this is the problem. So in this country, our geographical inequality is a big problem with philanthropy. But I do think the government could do a lot more to incentivise it, actually, in terms of tax and things like that. We should look at it.
Yeah, we should. I am very conscious of time, and I know that we've got to flip around this room for another event in 15 minutes. So I'm actually just going to come to our sponsor for a final word. I apologise, Imogen and Richard. It's my fault for not managing time effectively. But Richard, if you want to answer the second question, and then
only through the lens of pride of place again. So, and as Richard emphasised in those towns where he's working, if you get this right in terms of that physical asset, I think it can help quite a lot in terms of crime prevention and so on, because you've got a place where people do feel pride. And I know that's been a contention within the Levelling White Paper as to the distinction between long-term structural investment versus short-term impact, of which pride of place could be one. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you very much to the Post Office again for facilitating this discussion, and to all of our panellists for giving such thoughtful remarks. And actually, it feels like we've had quite a broad-ranging discussion, but there have been some really strong common themes coming through it. The importance of local assets, the extent to which the services that those assets provide are not purely financial or economic in nature. They're deeply social and community based as well. It's been fantastic hearing from Richard some of the kind of real life stories of the role that your stores play in the communities that they serve, and it's been fantastic to hear from some of you in the audience about your experiences too. So thank you for giving up your time. It's been a real pleasure for me to chair this discussion, and I hope that we can continue to push this agenda, because I think it's really, really important. It quite often gets neglected in our politics, but it is, as Peter said, becoming more important, I think, in our politics. And just as a final word, if Miriam and Imogen would like to do some joint work on philanthropy in the UK, I would be delighted to
Make
do
a change
that.
from stealing your work.
Yeah, well, no, we're all about collaboration, especially with you guys. So thank you all, and if you could just join me in a round of applause for our panellists. Thank you.
Stop measuring, exactly. I know, exactly.